morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, March 1st, 2021. Hope you had a great weekend, and thank you for joining me to kick off your week here. But on this episode, I'm going to talk about how a true revolution for liberty is actually a revolution in thought. It's a huge change in the minds and hearts of the people. And you may already know that's how John Adams described the American Revolution. But I've also got some great insight on that change of the minds of the people from Mercy Otis Warren. And maybe we've actually been in the early days of a revolution in thought right here today. So I've got some interesting strategic advice on that from John Dickinson, Thomas Jefferson, and Samuel Adams. But first of all, before getting into all that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives for over 2.5 years on individual episodes like this one today. I publish those generally about a half hour to an hour on the website at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, about a half hour to an hour after the live broadcast is over. And then I include a ton of different platforms because just in case someday you notice that we're missing from whatever platform you've been watching us on, we want to be as many places or wherever you want us to be. But if we happen to be kicked off, you'll be able to find us on all the others, whether it's on library.tv or odyssey.com or Gab TV or DLive or Brighteon, BitChute, and the rest. And we also have the podcast editions at Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podbean, and elsewhere. You can also find our membership program over on that show homepage, and that's where you can support us, put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Find all that and more, again, that show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat and allow people a few more moments to get notifications to join us on the live stream. There's Tim Martin, Funky Euphemism, Tyler B., Bob Landry, good to see you. MRGF78, DHD, Clay Kent, Off Grid Nation over on DLive, that's pretty cool. Patricia Dance, Blue North Wind, Too Tall, Neil, and others over on YouTube, Facebook. We've got Dwayne, and wow, I'm just scrolling through getting as many as I can, but I appreciate you all being here. I know I'm going to miss a few. There's Larry Clark and others. Thank you for spending some of your Monday with me today. But let's dive right to this. I will look at the chat a little bit later if I've got time on the live stream to address some questions or comments. But I do read through the chat a little bit later on in the day and reply to as many as possible, usually just as a handful when I get an opportunity. Hi to Amy Nelson as well. Happy Monday to you too. I want to start out with an article that is excerpted from the 2017 State of the Nullification Movement report. We've been doing this almost yearly for a long, long time. This is from Mike Meharry, and here's how he put it. He says, "We are in the midst of a revolution, but it's not a revolution in the sense most people think of. It's not a war fought with guns and bombs. It's a battle of ideas. Today's revolution is a revolution in thought." And I know those of you who have been regularly watching or listening to this program, you at some time have heard me reference a letter that John Adams wrote in 1818 to a guy named Hezekiah Niles. And here's how John Adams described the American Revolution. He says, "But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced." You couldn't get to that point, Adams was telling us. You couldn't get to that point where people were willing to put their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor on the line until you had a change of viewpoint. You just don't get from point A to point Z, point B, any other point in one single step. It took a huge change. And what was that change? Adams put it this way: the revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments, of their duties and obligation. One of the alterations that he talked about, that's how he referred to them, alterations in the views of the people, he said this was common to all. The people of America had been educated in a habitual affection for England as their mother country. So think about that. Like, if you're raised from birth to have an affection to some far-off centralized power as being, good to you, protecting you, saving you, serving you, or owe you something you owe your allegiance to, it's going to be very likely that you will continue in that in your adult life, and maybe forever. We've certainly faced that today, especially with the proliferation of government-funded and government-run schools, government-approved education. I know that I learned in school, I went to a Catholic school as a kid, and of course, you go to a Catholic school, you're going to learn that Catholicism is the solution to your problems that you face. Now, then when I went to a government-run school, they call them public schools. I learned in every situation that government, now, of course, I learned that in the Catholic school as well, but when I went to public school or government school, I certainly learned that all solutions, government was, all problems, government was the solution. And of course, they skipped over a lot of the really horrible things. I didn't learn about concentration camps, the internment of people during World War. I did not learn about the bombings in Tulsa in the 1920s. I did not learn about how nullification was used to resist federal slavery laws in the 1850s. There's a lot of stuff that they selectively ignore. Now, not every place does that these days, because you do have some independent teachers that try to bring some truth and a well-balanced history, but we certainly were taught, or at least I learned, that if there was a problem, Washington, D.C. was going to be the fix for everything. And John Adams is talking about that as well. In essence, look, the people were educated in this affection to the crown, to their mother country. And he says, but when they found her a cruel beldam willing, they found her a cruel beldam willing, like Lady Macbeth, to dash their brains out, it is no wonder if their filial affections ceased and were changed into indignation and horror. So one of the things that they learned was this so-called loving mother country was evil to them, was willing to use violence against them and to dash their brains out. And he concludes this section with this: this radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people was the real American Revolution. Now, he was not the only one who talked about things in these ways. I've got an excerpt from the great Mercy Otis Warren, who in her History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, which was first published in 1805 but was written over many, many years, she put it this way: there were several classes in America who were at first exceedingly opposed to measures that militated with the designs of administration. There were various classes, she said, that were opposed to any resistance against the current administration or the people in charge, Parliament, the king, and the like. They didn't want to do this. She says some were impressed by a long connection. This was the habit of the day. Were intimidated by her power and attached by affection to Britain. This is the same type of thing that John Adams was saying some years later in that letter to Hezekiah Niles. She says others were true disciples of passive obedience. Some people believe that it is wrong in every situation, in any situation, to oppose the established lawmaking authority of the people. Whether those lawmakers are violating the rules that have been given to them or not, you just have to obey and figure it out later. James Otis Jr. at one point said that this is the most dangerous person on earth, the person that would be saying it's not prudent to oppose the people. Now, you're always basically supporting the status quo. Anyways, Mercy says there were these true disciples of passive obedience. They had real scruples of conscience with regard to any resistance to the powers that be. These, whether actuated by affection or fear, by principle or interest, they formed a close combination with the colonial governors, custom house officers, and all in subordinate departments who hung on the court for subsistence. I mean, it almost kind of sounds like the welfare state or government employees of today. There aren't as many people, I think, today that think it's always wrong to oppose a government action, but they certainly do exist. They tell us the only way that we can go about changing things is to vote the bums out or to get the federal courts to limit federal power, which I will touch on a little bit more in just a bit. Mercy continues. She says, there is a certain supineness which generally overspreads the multitude. and disposes mankind to submit quietly to any form of government, rather than to be at the expense and hazard of resistance. She's acknowledging part of human nature. And I talked about in a recent episode how the founders didn't just magically come up with a bunch of predictions on how things might play out if they weren't worked properly, or how things would play out, warnings for the future of liberty and for the Constitution itself. It's not that they were just divinely inspired. They were students of history, and they were students of human nature. And recognizing here, Mercy Otis Warren, that human nature drives people to want to be comfortable, to live their life at ease rather than risk everything that they have, even if what they have is very little. She says they would rather submit to any form of government rather than be at the expense and hazard of resistance. She goes on. She says they become attached to ancient modes by habits of obedience, though the reins of authority are sometimes held by the most rigorous hand. Thus, she says, we have seen in all ages, again, a study of history, an understanding of history. It wasn't just here and there, but through all ages, she recognized, the many become the slaves of the few, preferring the wretched tranquility of inglorious ease. They patiently yield to despotic masters, until awakened by multiple wrongs to the feelings of human nature, which then once aroused to a consciousness of the native freedom and equal rights of man, ever revolts at the idea of servitude. Short version, humans would rather, and I think it makes sense, most average people, most people would rather live their lives. They would rather do what they love. They would rather have hobbies, watch TV, play games, spend time with their family, with their friends, with their pets, make food, go for a walk, stuff that I like doing. I mean, these are things that I like doing. I don't want to have to spend all my time resisting tyranny or educating people on that. But this, at some point, things get so bad where the people actually say enough is enough. Now, not everybody was on board with this. Here on August 1st, 1776, you'd think that everyone had come together at this point. Well, Samuel Adams gave his very famous, very well read American independence speech on August 1st, 1776. The Declaration was technically signed and completed on August 2nd, so he was actually presenting this to the public, and we know his famous speech. He was basically addressing this mentality that Mercy Otis Warren was talking about, and he put it this way: if ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude than the animating contest of freedom, go from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or our arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. Here we are, we're at the time to have the animating contest of freedom, August 1st, 1776. And if you're not on board, you know what? I hope you are just comfortable with your chains and your servitude isn't too bad, but you are not part of this American independence. I covered Samuel Adams' speech in some detail in an episode last summer, Samuel Adams, American Independence. I will link to that in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out, or at least read through his speech, which I will link to in the show notes as well, because it's pretty awesome. And there's a bunch of quotes in there that I think we've all heard over time, but put together and thinking in the context of independence being signed the next day is pretty huge. But anyways, going a little bit further with Mercy Otis Warren again, she goes on. She says, perhaps the story of political revolution never exhibited a more general enthusiasm in the cause of liberty than that which for several years pervaded all ranks in America. I think they all understood that there were divisions in class, in political views, in economic views, in religious views throughout the country, throughout the colonies. And we saw those divisions, of course, come up more and more during the debates over the ratification of the convention, through the time of the Articles of Confederation, which is today in history. I guess we've got a post coming on that on the website pretty soon from Dave Bednar. But also the years after the ratification of the Constitution, you started seeing those divisions come become broader. And there was a very short time where people set aside those differences for common cause against the empire to advance liberty, in the hopes of advancing liberty, of course. She says there was perhaps never a more general enthusiasm in the cause of liberty than that which for several years pervaded all ranks in America and brought forward events little expected by the most sanguine spirits in the beginning of the controversy. So the most positive or optimistic period, people in the early days, you're thinking about the time, maybe 1765, 1770, and the like, even the most optimistic people probably didn't think that everyone would come together the way they did. And it wasn't everyone, of course, because otherwise Samuel Adams would have been telling people, get the hell out of here. We don't need you. Go with your masters, and we'll forget that we were ever countrymen. Mercy goes on. She says, a contest now pushed with so much vigor that the intelligent yeomanry of the country, as well as those educated in the higher walks, became convinced that nothing less than a systematical plan of slavery was designed against them. So really what we were talking about was a huge, just like John Adams described, a huge change in the perspective of the people. It was a revolution in thought, and a revolution in thought, especially across broad swaths of the population, is one that actually rarely happens throughout history. And I think today we are in the very early stages. I know Mike called it a revolution in thought in our State of the Nullification Movement report, and I think we're at the early stages. I think history will be able to tell us sometime in the future if this develops far enough where it really catches on. I think we are, though, in the very early stages of what could become a true long-term revolution in thought. For decades and decades and decades, of course, we know that when people want to address a problem with federal power, they've done a few things that have just not worked. They basically focus all their hopes on one-size-fits-all solutions or a one-size-fits-all national, centralized, federal solution for anything and everything. They spend time trying to vote the bums out in the hopes that the new bums are going to reject all the power that's just been sitting there, or that the new bums are going to start doing the right thing. Or they're going to march on D.C. in the hopes that demanding, or in essence really begging those current bums or the new ones to do the right thing is going to get them to do that. Or they put all their time, money, and energy into suing the federal government in federal court in the hopes that federal judges appointed by federal politicians are going to somehow limit federal power. And we know that these are not really good strategies. For those of you who watch or listen to this program regularly, you know that people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison never told us that this should be our first response to exercises of power outside the Constitution. Jefferson very expressly pointed out that a vote the bums out strategy is only for a misadministration of the delegated powers. But when there's a usurpation, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Usurpation meaning an exercise of powers not delegated to the government in the Constitution. Now, in the last few years, and we started our organization, I registered the 10th Amendment Center domain back in the summer of 2006 with the goal of teaching people that, you know, basically everything that they do, whatever team is in power, they basically either are not authorized to do it, or it costs way more, or they're not allowed to do it in the first place, or they lied about what they've been doing all along. So basically, most things that they do in Washington, D.C. are not within the bounds of the Constitution, and we have to have something else to reject, resist, and defeat those programs, because relying on the federal government to limit its own power absolutely doesn't work. So in the last few years, we've actually seen more nullification and nullification type bills introduced and passed on a state and even a local level than at any time in our history. And I want to go back to Mike Meharry. Oh, actually, we've covered this in our State of the Nullification Movement report. I know I'm citing his article on the 2017 report, but if you go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, you can see the State of the Nullification Movement, which is a free download. You don't have to sign up for anything, give any of your information, nothing. You can just go there. You can see the PDF version. You can get a Mobi format, which is for Kindle. I'm not super happy with the Kindle format formatting, so maybe next year will be a little bit improved, but there's also the Apple and Android edition. It's 108 pages. The first half of it is an overview of the principles, the legal basis, and the historical use of nullification. And the second half is how it's being implemented in current times. And I think it's very, very enlightening because a lot of people aren't covering this type of thing. They'll maybe, in the mainstream media, if they even cover any state-level resistance to federal power, they'll talk about it in a bad way, but they're not connecting the dots. And even though many of the issues that we cover, they don't overlap, and they don't like all of them, we can actually see how more and more and more people are actually getting on board with taking action on an issue that's important to them on a state or a local level, despite what the federal government has to say. So this is the very early stages of what I think is a revolution in thought, and maybe it's because the federal government has grown so large that they just have no choice, and I don't really care if that's their motivation. But what it is it's the right approach, the right strategy. Mike points out here the TAC was founded in 2006. At that time, nullification was a maligned idea relegated to the dustbin of history. It wasn't really being used. Certainly we know Prop 215 passed in 1995 here in California, and the Gonzalez versus Raich case in 2005, 10 years later. So there was some level of resistance, but it was not very widespread at all. He says, in our early years, we counted the mere introduction of a non-binding resolution in support of the 10th Amendment as a major success. There wasn't much more than that. But from those small seeds, a formidable nullification movement has grown up over the past 11 plus years, now 15 plus years. And in that year alone, or that previous year, more than 450 pieces of legislation to limit federal power in some way were introduced in state legislatures across the country. So we're seeing from small things, small steps, small statements of non-binding resolutions and other actions grow into something larger. And that's really what John Dickinson said. I do have the membership card. We've got it on our annual membership card here. John Dickinson's great Latin phrase that he used to sign off on the first letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania in response to the hated Townsend Acts of 1767, Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. And we follow that strategic advice from John Dickinson, that even though we have to hold to our ultimate principles, which I'll get to in a moment, we recognize that if you're taking a stand against the largest government in the history of the world, and they were doing the same thing at the time in the 1760s, that every step forward for liberty is a victory. Sometimes even steps forward that don't seem like they are, like a non-binding resolution opposing something. It draws people, it rallies people to the cause, and it encourages them to take further action. Going a little bit further, we also have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's advice is basically the same thing. And Meharry puts it this way: turning things around from a government with tens of thousands of unconstitutional laws, regulations, rules, and orders on the books isn't going to happen in a single step. And that's where that small things grow great by concord comes in. And also the same advice from Thomas Jefferson, which I've mentioned many times on this show, in a letter that he wrote in 1790 to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay. And I'll just highlight it here again. The ground of liberty, Jefferson put it, is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. So just every time you get a small victory, you have to recognize that there's still more and more and more to do. And you have to set the foundation for people in the future to take that torch and run with it. And why? Jefferson says it takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. A lot of people are afraid. They're happy in their current habits. They don't know that more liberty is actually a good thing. They've been taught in government propaganda centers that everything has to have control and regulation and dominance from a centralized authority. And people who don't want to agree with that, you have to use violence to force them to. And over time, it takes a long time to teach people that in practice, you don't have to have that kind of a system. Jefferson, again, had the same type of mentality years later, 8 years later in this situation, in his letter to James Madison the day after the governor of Kentucky signed the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, which were Jefferson's words in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And here's how he put it. Here's a copy of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain, so as to hold to that ground in the future, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. We don't know in every situation how far is too far and how far is too little. So we have to actually think about events on the ground. A lot of times those events are different regionally. So if we're talking about nullification efforts, let's say on the right to keep and bear arms, nullifying federal violations of the Second Amendment, for example, basically all federal gun control on the books. In Missouri, they may be able to go more aggressively than in a place like Arizona or Texas or North Carolina or vice versa. I don't know. I'm not arrogant enough to actually say that this is the only way and this is the way you have to do it in every single place. Well, maybe I've been in the past, but I try to not be that way. We don't know, and we have to encourage people to have an ultimate principle. What's their ultimate end goal? And then take steps that are always pushing things forward towards that goal. That's how Thomas Jefferson put it. Or here's how Samuel Adams put it in one of his great letters in the Boston Gazette, which was really kind of the mouthpiece, the organ of the Sons of Liberty. Here, writing as Candidus, October 14th, 1771, he said, "The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution, are worth defending at all hazards. And it is our duty to defend them against all attacks. We have received them as a fair inheritance from our worthy ancestors. So it is our duty to actually defend attacks on our liberty." And he says, when you actually make progress, he says, instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, they want you to get a small step and just be done with it. Oh, victory, victory for liberty. We got this guy in office. We got this lawsuit done. Whatever it may be, we rejected this piece of federal power. Just stop there. Be happy with that, and that's it. And this is where strategy and ultimate principles kind of can work together or work against each other. If your ultimate principle is some kind of half-ass small step, then you're actually helping the enemies. But if you have a good long-term vision and then you work each step towards it, that's exactly what they don't want. So he says, instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, in 1771, if you think about the timing, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times, more than ever, calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. That's from the father of the American Revolution, Samuel Adams, writing as Candidus, October 14th, 1771. Taking a look over the live chat, I hope you guys are finding this interesting. I hope it's educational, of course, more than anything. I hope you're learning something. If you like the show, you like this episode, please consider smashing the like and let me take a look over at the live chat. Or if you're on a podcast platform, reviews on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere really help a ton. All these platforms have algorithms, at least the mainstream ones, that are pretty easily triggered. So when you do that stuff, it tells the platform to show the program to more people. I think it was Clay Kent. He says, how does one eat an elephant? I don't know, with a lot of barbecue sauce? He says, one bite at a time, of course. Certainly not by asking the elephant itself to assist in the daunting task. Great. That is a really good analogy. I've never actually heard that. How does one eat an elephant? Yeah, you're talking about a giant beast. And if we're talking about the largest government in the history of the world, the monster state that is Washington, D.C., and the state governments, many of which are just basically acting as corporations or large counties for that federal government. The way to actually deal with it is one step at a time. Funky Euphemism asks about U.S. versus Lopez. I've actually never done a real deep dive on that, and I know a lot of friends actually cite that, so I appreciate you bringing that up. Blue Northwind says, Michael's invisible podium is super psychedelic at the moment. I should just get, we could go full TikTok style and just add some background music to make it fun. Taking a look a little bit further here in the chat. Dwayne Morgan says, this old country boy will not cower or comply. Now, of course, This is a great mentality to have, but we also have to always assess our own risks. I'm not really recommending that everybody just go out there blazing nuts and just refuse and trying to get themselves arrested, things like that. You have to be smart about this, and you want to encourage others to join in. The end result, if we're looking at 36 states and counting, which have legalized a plant despite the fact that every level of the federal government considers that plant illegal and has so since 1937 or so. You know, 36 states define them. You know that when enough people say no to the federal government and enough states or localities end up following those people, it starts with human action, and then enough states or individual communities pass laws or ordinances backing those people up, there's not much the federal government can do to force their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates down our throats. Blue North Wind says nothing is ours except the debt, which we did not ourselves create individually. I've heard some cases for repudiating that debt. I'm not sure really a lot about that. But that's interesting. Marie Larkin says, oh yes, work smart. And absolutely, we do have to be smart about our strategy. And that's why I think Jefferson is so important to mention. I want to read it one more time before we head out of here. He says, I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles that the Kentucky Resolves of 1798 contain. You have to have your ultimate principles. You have to have that as your end goal. If you have a soft end goal, you're never going to, you're probably, realistically, if we're thinking really honestly here, my end goal for liberty is not going to happen in our lifetime. It's just not. So if I lower my standards, then everything I achieve is going to be even lower than that. So you start with a high bar and you work your way up to it. And then hopefully, if you set a good foundation for the future, other people will learn what that high bar is, be convinced that that is the right goal to have, and then take what you've worked on, and instead of stopping halfway in 20, 30, 50 years, they've got way more to go. And in the long run, we're setting the stage for liberty for the future. And we have to, as Jefferson put it, leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities. We are committed to that, but it doesn't have to be at the moment, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. Marie Larkin, again, build the liberty movement. Yes, step by step, brick by brick. And that's the way Jeff Dice, my friend over at the Mises Institute, put it at an event, I think it's like a year and a half ago now, 2020. I can barely remember it existed. But I was really, really honored to be one of the featured speakers at a Mises annual event here in Los Angeles. I think this was October of 2019 now. And Jeff did a kind of a behind-the-scenes supporter speech at a dinner, and he basically said, look what we're doing. We're just putting out educational tools. And you can love Mises.org or not. I think they're great friends of the TAC and has been for a long time. But Jeff, I think, was absolutely correct when he said, look, this is the way to build liberty. Brick by brick, person by person, building a foundation for the future. Anyways, again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope you learned something today. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I will, of course, publish all the links in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty in the next half hour to an hour-ish. And of course, if you want to support the show, you can do so over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where you can sign up for a membership, put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thanks for spending some of your time with me today. I hope your week is off to a great start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.